The dust swirled around Ilara Williams as another boot found her ribs. She curled tighter against the boardwalk, her black morning dress torn at the shoulder. The town of Redemption Creek had stopped to watch. No one moved to help. Silas Crane stood over her like a storm cloud, his face twisted with rage. His voice carried across the silent street as he delivered another kick to her side. Worthless mouth to feed. Nothing but shame to my name. Ilara's hands pressed against the dry earth. The taste of dust filled her mouth. Around her, boots shuffled backward. Doors creaked shut. The watching eyes belonged to people who had forgotten how to see. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the stillness. A stranger dismounted near the hitching post. His boots struck the ground with purpose. The crowd parted as he walked forward, his hand resting easy near his gun belt. His eyes held something the town had misplaced long ago. "That's enough, mister." Silas turned, his face flushed with anger and surprise. His fists remained clenched at his sides. The stranger stood between him and Ilara, close enough that Silas had to look up to meet his gaze. "This is family business, stranger. Beating a woman in the street ain't family business. It's cowardice." The word hung in the air like smoke. Silas's jaw worked soundlessly. His eyes darted to the watching crowd, measuring his humiliation against his rage. The stranger's hand never moved from his gun belt, but his fingers drummed once against the leather. Ilara pushed herself up from the dust. Her body ached in places she couldn't name. The stranger's shadow fell across her like shelter she hadn't known she needed. "You have no idea what just walked into, stranger." Silas's voice dropped to a whisper meant to carry. "This town has secrets that bury people." The stranger's expression didn't change. He reached down and offered Ilara his hand. She stared at it for a long moment, this unexpected kindness from a man whose face she'd never seen. His palm was calloused from honest work. She took it. He pulled her to her feet with gentle strength. Her legs shook beneath her, but she stood. The crowd watched this small rebellion like it might spread. Silas stepped back, his face dark with promises. He looked at each watching face in turn, memorizing them. His gaze lingered longest on the stranger. "This ain't over. It is for today." Silas walked away, his boots striking the boardwalk harder than necessary. His men followed, their spurs jingling a retreat that sounded more like a threat. The crowd began to disperse, heads down, moving faster than they had arrived. Ilara stood in the settling dust, studying the man who had saved her. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by sun and wind and decisions that had cost him sleep. His eyes held depths she couldn't read. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Sometimes that's the only reason someone will help. She brushed dust from her dress, the motion automatic and futile. The fabric was torn beyond easy repair. Like most things in her life lately. You made an enemy today, wouldn't be the first time. The stranger looked down the street where Silas had disappeared. His expression was thoughtful, calculating. Like a man reading weather signs in a threatening sky. "You got somewhere safe to go?" Ilara almost laughed. Safe was a word that had lost meaning 6 months ago when Thomas died. When the accident that wasn't an accident had left her alone with a stepfather who blamed her for breathing. "Safe ain't something I got much of anymore. Then we best find you some." She studied his face for the lie, the angle, the payment. He'd expect later. Men didn't help for free. Not in Redemption Creek, not anywhere she'd ever been. But his eyes held something steady. Something that reminded her of Thomas in his better moments, before the worry had started eating at him. Before he'd started asking questions that got a man killed. "I don't even know your name." Arthur Callahan. The name meant nothing to her, but she filed it away. Names had power in small towns. They carried weight and history and debts that passed from father to son. "I'm Ilara Williams. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Williams." The title hurt. It reminded her of what she'd lost, what she'd never get back, but she wore it like armor anyway. It was all she had left of Thomas. Arthur looked around the empty street. The town had swallowed its witnesses, leaving only dust and the echo of violence. His horse waited patiently at the hitching post, used to trouble. "You hungry?" She was. She'd been hungry for months, living on Silas's scraps and charity that came with a price. But admitting hunger felt like admitting defeat. "I don't have money to pay you back." Didn't ask for payment. He started walking toward the hotel, his gait unhurried but purposeful. After a moment, she followed. Her ribs ached with each step, but she kept up. Pride was about all. She had left, and she wouldn't lose it to a limp. The hotel dining room was nearly empty. The few customers looked up when they entered, their eyes taking in her torn dress and his trail dust. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Arthur chose a table by the window where he could watch the street. Old habits from a life she couldn't guess at. He ordered coffee and whatever the kitchen had ready. The waitress took his money like it might burn her fingers. "You're not from around here." "No, ma'am." "What brings you to Redemption Creek?" Arthur looked out the window at the dusty street. His reflection in the glass was ghostly, insubstantial. Like a man who'd learned to disappear when necessary. Unfinished business. The coffee arrived weak and bitter. Alara wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep through her fingers. It was the first kindness she'd received in months. Outside, Sheriff Dutch Davidson walked past the window. His star caught the afternoon light, but his eyes stayed fixed on the ground. He'd been there during the beating, watching like all the rest. The law in Redemption Creek had learned to look the other way. Arthur noticed the sheriff, too. His expression hardened, reading some story in the man's defeated posture. "How long's your stepfather been running things around here?" "Since before I got here, maybe longer." Alara sipped her coffee, tasting ashes. "Thomas used to say Silas had his hooks in everything that mattered." "Your husband?" "Was. He died 6 months back. Wagon accident on the mountain road." Arthur's cup stopped halfway to his lips. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition she couldn't place. "Thomas Williams?" She nodded, surprised he'd known Thomas's name. Surprised anyone remembered him at all. "I'm sorry for your loss." The words carried weight beyond politeness, like they meant something personal to him. Like Thomas's death had been his loss too. Before she could ask, the hotel door opened. One of Silas's men stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room until they found Arthur and Alara. He didn't approach, just stood there like a message carved in flesh. Arthur set down his coffee cup. The sound was soft but final. Time to go. They left through the hotel's back door. The alley smelled of rotting wood and broken promises. Arthur's horse waited where he'd moved it, away from watching eyes. Alara's steps were careful on the uneven ground. "Where can we go that's safe?" Arthur studied the late afternoon sky. Clouds gathered like thoughts he couldn't voice. The wind carried dust and the scent of rain that might never come. "Your husband's workshop still standing?" "Silas boarded it up after the funeral. Said it was too dangerous. Might be the only place in town he ain't watching." They walked through back streets where weeds grew between forgotten stones. The workshop sat at the edge of town, its windows dark with grime and abandonment. The boards across the door were weathered gray, nailed in haste. Arthur pulled the boards away with steady hands. The nails screamed against old wood. Inside, the smell of cold metal and dead fires lingered. Thomas's tools hung on the walls like sleeping ghosts. Alara stepped inside and touched the anvil. Her fingers traced its scarred surface, reading stories written in hammer strikes and honest sweat. The forge stood cold, its mouth full of ashes. He spent more time here than anywhere else those last few months. What was he working on? Said he was making something for the future, something that would matter. Arthur moved through the workshop, his eyes taking in details. A man's workspace told stories about his mind, his fears, his hopes. Thomas had been methodical, careful, the kind of man who kept records. He hid things here. Ilara looked up from the anvil. Her expression was guarded, protective. Even in death, she kept Thomas's secrets. Why would you ask that? Because he was smart. And smart men don't trust everything to memory. She watched him for a long moment. The dying light through the grimy windows painted them both in shades of amber and shadow. Finally, she moved to a workbench and felt along its underside. A hidden drawer slid open. Inside were papers, documents tied with string that had once been white, maps marked with symbols that might have been innocent, letters written in Thomas's careful hand. Arthur reached for them, but Ilara pulled them back. These are private. Maybe, but they might also be the reason he's dead. The words hung between them like smoke. Truth had a way of changing everything, even when spoken soft. Ilara untied the string with trembling fingers. The papers fell open like wounds, land deeds with signatures that looked wrong, bills of sale for cattle that belonged to other men, a list of names written in columns, some crossed out in red ink. Thomas was investigating something before he died. Something about stolen cattle and forged documents. Arthur studied the papers over her shoulder. His breath was warm against her ear, steady and real. The documents told a story of systematic theft, of families robbed with the stroke of a pen. Maybe some stones are better left unturned. Not when they're covering up murder. She turned to face him. The movement brought them close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the way he carried in his shoulders. He looked at her like she was something precious and fragile. You really think Thomas was killed? I know he was. Arthur reached for one of the papers, a letter addressed in Thomas's hand. The name on the envelope made his breath catch. His fingers went still. A Callahan. Ilara saw the name at the same moment. Her eyes moved from the letter to Arthur's face, reading the truth written there in guilt and recognition. You're Thomas's brother. The words fell like stones into still water. Arthur's hand dropped to his side. He turned away, unable to meet her eyes. He talked about you. Said you were a lawman who walked away from justice. I came here to honor his last wish. But I was too late to save him. Ilara opened the letter with careful hands. Thomas's words spilled out, written in the urgent script of a man who knew time was running short. Arthur, if you're reading this, then something's happened to me. Silas Crane is stealing from everyone in this county. Forging deeds, rustling cattle, bribing officials. I've got proof, but I need someone I can trust, someone who still believes in doing what's right. Protect Ilara. She's all that matters now. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Thomas died. Arthur sat heavily on a wooden crate. His head fell into his hands, and for a moment he looked like a man carrying the weight of every wrong decision he'd ever made. He wrote to you. He asked for help. The letter took 3 weeks to reach me in Colorado. By the time I got here, he was already in the ground. You came anyway. I owed him that much. Ilara folded the letter carefully, preserving Thomas's last words. The workshop grew darker as the sun died behind the mountains. Shadows stretched across the floor like reaching hands. What did you two fight about? Arthur looked up, his eyes catching the last light. Old pain lived there, worn smooth by years of carrying it. I was a deputy marshal. Had a chance to do something right, stop some bad men from hurting good people. But the politics got complicated. The men I was supposed to arrest had friends in high places. So you walked away. I walked away. Thomas said I was a coward. Said justice didn't care about politics or friendship or keeping the peace. Sighed. It was just right or wrong, and I'd chosen wrong. Was he right? Arthur stood and walked to the window. The town spread below them, lights beginning to flicker in windows. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the corruption that surrounded them. He was right about everything, including this. Arthur picked up another document from the pile, a map of the county with properties marked in different colors. Red marks covered half the territory, properties that had changed hands in the past 5 years. He was tracking the thefts. Look at this. Ilara joined him at the window. The map told the story of systematic dispossession, Mexican families, freed slaves, widows, orphans. Anyone without power or protection had lost their land to Silas Crane. Mrs. Chun's property, the Santos family ranch. Old Pete Morrison's claim, all of them, all of them. Thomas documented everything. Bills of sale, forged deeds, witness statements. He was building a case. Outside, a rider passed on the main street. Even in the growing darkness, they could see the star on his vest. Sheriff Dutch Davidson, making his evening rounds with the careful steps of a man who'd learned not to see too much. The sheriff's part of it. Has to be. This much corruption doesn't happen without the law looking the other way. Arthur gathered the papers carefully. Thomas's investigation represented months of dangerous work. Each document was a risk he'd taken, a truth he'd uncovered at the cost of his life. What do we do with this? We finish what Thomas started. That got him killed. Maybe, but leaving it unfinished dishonors his memory. Ilara touched the cold anvil again. Her husband's presence seemed to linger in the workshop, in the tools he'd shaped with his hands, in the evidence he'd died protecting. Silas will come looking for us. Let him come. His men will search every building in town. Then we don't stay in town. Arthur moved to the back of the workshop where Thomas had stored his raw materials. Behind a stack of iron bars, he found what he was looking for. A small door, partially hidden, that led to a root cellar. Thomas always was clever. The cellar was dry and dark, carved into the hillside behind the workshop. Thomas had stocked it with supplies, maybe for emergencies. Maybe for the day he'd known would come. He planned for this. He planned for everything. They settled into the underground space as full darkness claimed the town above. Arthur lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. The light painted their faces in gold, and Shadow, why didn't you come sooner? Because I was still the same coward who walked away from justice once before. But you're here now. Now might be too late. Ilara spread Thomas's papers on the dirt floor. The evidence of Silas's crime surrounded them like accusations. Each document was a life stolen, a family destroyed, a future taken. It's not too late, not if we're willing to finish what Thomas started. Above them, the sound of horses reached the workshop. Voices called out in the darkness, searching. Silas's men had come looking, just as they'd known they would. Arthur extinguished the lantern. In the complete darkness, Ilara's breathing was the only sound. Her presence was warm beside him, real and steady in a world that had forgotten both qualities. The voices faded, the horses moved on, but they would return. Men like Silas always returned until they found what they were hunting. Thomas would be proud of you. For hiding in a hole in the ground, for not giving up. Arthur reached for the papers in the darkness, Thomas's investigation, his brother's legacy, the evidence that might finally bring justice to Redemption Creek. We'll need help. Can't do this alone. The whole town's afraid of Silas. Then we'll have to remind them what courage looks like. Dawn came gray and cold to Redemption Creek. Arthur climbed from the root cellar first, his joints stiff from sleeping on hard ground. The workshop stood empty above them, morning light filtering through dirty windows. No sound of searching horses, no voices calling threats. But the quiet felt wrong, heavy with watching eyes. Ilara emerged from the cellar, Thomas's papers wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The evidence felt heavier in daylight, weighted with the lives it represented. She tucked the bundle inside her coat, close to her heart. They'll be watching the streets. Arthur nodded toward the back door. Beyond it lay the creek that gave the town its name, shallow water running over stones worn smooth by time. They could follow it north, stay hidden in the brush until they reached the church. Reverend Hayes. Helped Thomas before. Might help us now. They moved through the morning mist, their footsteps muffled by wet earth. The creek whispered secrets to the stones, old truths about persistence and patience. Water always found its way, no matter what stood in its path. The church sat on a small rise overlooking the town. Its white walls were stained with weather and time, but the bell tower still reached toward heaven. Reverend Hayes was splitting wood behind the building, his axe falling with steady rhythm. He looked up as they approached. His weathered face showed no surprise, only the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned to read danger in the wind. Mrs. Williams, stranger, Reverend. Hayes set down his axe and wiped his hands on his pants. His eyes moved from Arthur to Alara, reading the story written in their dusty clothes and careful movements. Heard there was trouble in town yesterday. There was. Silas Crane's men were asking questions last night. About strangers. About folks who don't know their place. Arthur's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. Hayes noticed the movement, his expression growing more careful. This is God's house. All are welcome here, even troublemakers. Especially troublemakers. Hayes led them inside through the back door. The church was simple, wooden pews facing a plain altar. No stained glass or fancy decorations. Just honest wood and honest faith. You can stay here. For a while. But I can't protect you from the whole town's fear. Alara pulled out Thomas's papers. She spread them on the altar, turning sacred space into a courtroom. The evidence of Silas's crimes looked small and fragile in the morning light. Thomas died for this. Hayes put on his spectacles and studied the documents. His face grew grave as he read, the weight of understanding settling on his shoulders. Dear Lord, I knew Silas was greedy, but this, it's systematic theft. Families destroyed, lives ruined. Arthur moved to the window. The town below was waking up, smoke rising from chimneys, people beginning their daily routines. Normal life built on a foundation of corruption. How many people know? Some suspect, few know for certain. Even fewer would speak up if they did. Hayes gathered the papers carefully. His hands trembled slightly, whether from age or fear was. Hard to tell. What do you plan to do with this? Stop him. That's what got Thomas killed. Then we do it different. Better. The church door opened. All three froze as footsteps echoed in the empty space. Sheriff Dutch Davidson walked down the aisle, his star catching the light from the windows. His face was drawn, older than his years. Reverend Mrs. Williams. His eyes found Arthur. Stranger. Sheriff. Dutch's hand rested on his gun butt, but his posture was wrong, too hesitant. Too guilty. Like a man forced to play a role he hated. Silas wants to see you both. Says you took something that belongs to him. Arthur stepped forward, placing himself between Dutch and Alara. The movement was slight but clear. Protection offered without words. What would that be? You know what? Actually, I don't. Maybe you could explain it to me. Dutch's jaw worked silently. His eyes moved to the papers on the altar, then back to Arthur. Something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. He's not a patient man, Arthur, and he's got resources you don't. How do you know my name? I know lots of things, including what happens to folks who cross Silas Crane. Alara stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance. The gesture reminded Arthur of Thomas, stubborn in the face of impossible odds. What happened to Thomas? Dutch's composure cracked. His hand fell away from his gun, and for a moment he looked like what he was, a broken man carrying too much weight. Thomas asked too many questions, pushed too hard. Wouldn't listen when folks told him to let sleeping dogs lie. So you killed him? I didn't kill anybody. But you know who did. Dutch turned toward the door. His shoulders sagged under the weight of secrets and compromise. Come see Silas, both of you, before this gets worse. And if we refuse? Dutch stopped walking. His hand found the church door, gripping it tight enough to whiten his knuckles. Then more people die, starting with anyone who's helped you. He left without looking back. The church felt colder in his absence, touched by the shadow of threats and violence. Hayes sank into a pew, his face pale. The papers lay scattered. On the altar, Thomas's careful investigation disrupted by the reality of power and fear. He's right, you know. About Silas having resources. What kind of resources? Money, men, the kind of influence that reaches all the way to the territorial. Capital. Arthur gathered the papers, his movements careful and deliberate. Each document was a life Silas had stolen, a family he'd destroyed. The evidence demanded action, but action without planning was suicide. Tell me about the town. Who can be trusted? Mrs. Chun runs the general store. Her family lost their land to Silas 2 years ago. She knows what he is. Anyone else? Miguel Santos. His ranch borders Silas's spread. He's been losing cattle for months but can't prove anything. Ilara stood and smoothed her dress. The motion was automatic, a woman preparing for battle in her own way. What about the people who go to church, your congregation? They're good. People, scared people. But good. Scared people can find courage if they're not alone. Arthur studied the church, taking in the simple wooden cross above the altar, the worn pews where families gathered each Sunday. This was community. This was what Thomas had died trying to protect. Sunday service. How many people usually come? Most of the town. It's the one place where everyone gathers. Then that's where we make our stand. Hayes looked up, his eyes wide with alarm. The old preacher had seen enough violence to know how it started. You can't bring this fight into God's house. We're not bringing a fight. We're bringing truth. Truth has a way of starting fights. Arthur walked to the altar and placed his hand on Thomas's papers. The documents felt warm beneath his palm, charged with the weight of justice deferred. Thomas died trying to expose Silas quietly. Maybe it's time to do it loud. Outside, the sound of horses reached them. Multiple riders, moving with purpose. Silas's men, making their presence known. They're watching the church now. Let them watch. Ilara joined Arthur at the altar. Her hand covered his, both of them touching the evidence that had cost Thomas his life. If we do this, there's no going back. There was no going back the moment I helped you in the street. Hayes stood and walked to the window. The riders sat their horses at the edge of the churchyard, close enough to threaten, far enough to claim innocence. I've been preaching about courage for 20 years. Maybe it's time to practice what I preach. It's dangerous. Living under Silas Crane's thumb is dangerous too. At least this way, we choose our own danger. Arthur folded the papers carefully. Thomas's investigation would see daylight, one way or another. The truth would be spoken, whatever the cost. Sunday's 2 days away. We need to use that time to prepare. What kind of preparation? The kind that gives scared people reason to hope. The riders outside began to move, circling the church slow and deliberate. Their message was clear. They were watching. They were waiting. We'll need to reach people quietly, one at a time. That's dangerous too. Everything's dangerous now. Arthur looked out at the circling riders. Men who'd sold their souls for Silas's gold, who'd forgotten that some things were worth more than money, but some things are worth the risk. They left. The church through the back door as darkness fell. The riders had gone, but their presence lingered in the air like smoke. Arthur and Ilara moved through shadows, carrying Thomas's truth between them. Mrs. Chun's store stood at the corner of Main and third, its windows dark but for a single lamp burning in the back room. Arthur knocked soft against the rear door, 3 taps that might have been wind. The door opened a crack. Mrs. Chun's weathered face appeared, her eyes quick and cautious. She was a small woman made smaller by years of bending beneath other people's. Boots, we're closed. We're not here to buy anything. She studied their faces in the lamplight. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by fear. You're the ones Silas is hunting. We're the ones with proof of what he's done. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. The gesture spoke of losses counted in sleepless nights, of prayers offered to gods who seemed deaf to injustice. I can't help you. I won't risk my family. Ilara stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Women understood each other's fears in ways men never could. He stole your land, your family's future. And he'll steal more if I cross him. Not if we stop him first. Mrs. Chun's eyes moved between them, reading the determination written in their faces. She stepped aside, letting them enter her small world of shelves and shadows. The store smelled of flour and hope deferred. Arthur watched the street through the front window while Ilara spread Thomas's papers on the counter. The evidence looked fragile under the lamplight. This is your property deed. The real one. Mrs. Chun's fingers traced the paper, reading her own name in Thomas's careful handwriting. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. He kept copies. He kept everything. Why? Because he believed in justice, even when justice forgot to believe in him. Mrs. Chun studied the forged deed beside the real one. The signatures were close but not perfect. The kind of mistake that would hold up in court if anyone had the courage to challenge it. What do you want from me? Help us reach the others. The Santos family, old Pete Morrison. Everyone who lost something to Silas. They're scattered. Some left town. Others are too afraid to speak. Fear's a habit. It can be broken. Arthur turned from the window. The street was empty, but empty streets had eyes too. Silas's influence reached into every shadow, every whispered conversation. How many people come to Sunday service? Most of the town. Even folks who don't believe much in God believe in community. Then that's where we make our stand. Mrs. Chun folded the deeds carefully. Her movements were precise, economical. A woman who'd learned to make small gestures carry large meanings. Sunday's tomorrow. I know. That's not much time. It's the time we have. She looked at them. Both, these strangers who'd brought dangerous hope into her quiet desperation. Her choice hung in the air like dust motes, visible but fragile. Miguel Santos has a daughter. She works at the hotel. I could get word to him, carefully. Everything's careful when you're living under a man's boot. They left through the back door, carrying Mrs. Chun's reluctant trust like a flame that might die in the first strong wind. The night was cold, stars scattered across the sky like scattered hopes. Miguel Santos lived on the edge of town where the buildings gave way to scrubland and broken dreams. His house was small but well kept, the kind of place where pride still mattered even when everything else had been taken. He answered their knock with a shotgun in his hands and suspicion in his eyes. A man who'd learned that midnight visitors brought trouble. You're the ones causing problems for Silas. We're the ones with proof he's been stealing from you. Miguel's grip on the shotgun never wavered, but his eyes sharpened. The mention of proof carried weight in a world where accusations died for lack of evidence. What kind of proof? Arthur nodded to Ilara. She pulled out the papers, unfolding Miguel's stolen future on his own doorstep. Cattle bills, forged brands. Records of every head he's taken from your herd. Miguel lowered the shotgun. His free hand took the papers, holding them close to the lamplight. The numbers told the story of systematic theft, of a man's livelihood. Stolen one cow at a time, 200 head. Over 3 years. Thomas documented everything. Thomas Williams? The blacksmith? My husband. Miguel's expression softened. He'd known Thomas, respected him. The connection mattered in a world where trust was earned drop by drop. He died for this? He died trying to stop Silas. We're trying to finish what he started. How? Sunday service. We present the evidence to the whole town. Make it impossible for folks to pretend they don't know. Miguel handed back the papers. His face was thoughtful, calculating odds the way a man does when everything depends on the next bet. The whole town's afraid of Silas. Fear's just another kind of prison. We're offering them a key. Keys don't work if you're too scared to use them. Then we help them find their courage. They spent an hour in Miguel's kitchen, drinking coffee that tasted of hope and worry. He told them about other families, other losses. A network of victims too scattered and frightened to realize their own strength. Pete Morrison's still in town, lives above the barber shop. Lost his claim to a card game that wasn't quite honest. Anyone else? The widow Patterson, the Johnson boys. Maybe a dozen families if you count the ones who left. We need to reach them all. That's dangerous. Silas has eyes everywhere. Then we'll have to be careful. They left Miguel's house with promises given and received. Another small flame of hope lit in the darkness, fragile but real. The barber shop was closed, its windows dark. But light leaked from the apartment above, where Pete Morrison lived with his memories and his whiskey. Arthur climbed the outside stairs, each step a small betrayal of the silence. Pete opened the door before Arthur could knock. He was a thin man with hollow eyes and hands that shook slightly. The kind of man who'd lost everything and was still losing what was left. You're the stranger who faced down Silas. I am. Heard you got proof he's been cheating folks. I do. Pete stepped aside, letting Arthur enter the small room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and everything else. The space smelled of loneliness and defeat. Show me. Arthur spread Pete's papers on the small table. The forged gambling debt, the fake land transfer, the signatures that didn't quite match. Evidence of a con game played with marked cards and loaded dice. He cheated me fair and square. No such thing as fair cheating. Tell that to the judge who signed off on it. We're going to tell it to the whole town. Pete poured himself a drink from a bottle that was mostly empty. His hands still shook, but his eyes were clearer now. Anger had a way of burning through. Despair. When? Sunday service. He'll kill you both. Maybe, but the truth will still be spoken. Pete drank his whiskey in one swallow. The liquor seemed to steady him, or maybe it was the prospect of justice finally showing its face. What do you need from me? Just be there when we present the evidence. Stand up. Show the town that victims can find their voices. And if nobody else stands, then we'll know we tried. Arthur left Pete with his papers and his newfound anger. The night was ending, dawn touching the eastern sky with pale fingers. Sunday was coming whether they were ready or not. The church waited. In the gray light, its bell tower reaching toward heaven. Inside, Reverend Hayes was preparing for the most important sermon of his life. Alara knelt in the front pew, her hands folded in prayer. Arthur slipped into the pew beside her. Her presence was warm and steady, an anchor in the storm they were about to unleash. Are we doing the right thing? We're doing the only thing. Thomas would be proud. Thomas would be terrified. Just like us. Outside, the town was waking up. People would dress in their Sunday clothes, gather their families, walk to church as they had for years. But this Sunday would be different. This Sunday, the truth would finally have its day. Arthur reached for Alara's hand. Her fingers were cold but strong, calloused from work and grief, but still capable of holding hope. Whatever happens, we see it through. Together. Together. The church bell began to toll, calling the faithful to worship. But today, worship would wear a different face. Today, justice would speak from the pulpit. The church bell stopped tolling. Silence settled over Redemption Creek like dust after a windstorm. Arthur stood at the window, watching families walk toward the church in their Sunday clothes. Children skipped beside their parents, unaware that this morning would change everything. Alara arranged Thomas's papers on the altar. Each document was a life interrupted, a future stolen. The evidence lay spread across the sacred space where truth was supposed to live. "They're coming." Reverend Hayes emerged from the back room, his face pale but determined. He'd traded his usual gentle demeanor for something harder, forged in the fires of righteous anger. Mrs. Chun's family just arrived, Miguel Santos too. Arthur nodded. The people they'd spoken to were keeping their word. Small acts of courage that might grow into something larger. Pete Morrison, front row, hasn't taken his eyes off the papers since he sat down. The church filled slowly. Families taking their usual pews, nodding too. Neighbors settling into the rhythm of Sunday worship. But tension moved through the congregation like a current, felt more than seen. Mrs. Patterson sat with her granddaughter. The Johnson boys filed in wearing their cleanest shirts. Ordinary. People living ordinary lives, unaware they were about to become part of something extraordinary. Sheriff Dutch Davidson entered last, his star catching the morning light. He chose a seat in the back, close to the door. His hand rested on his gun belt, a habit born of years walking the line between law and corruption. Arthur felt the weight of Dutch's presence. The sheriff's divided loyalties would come to a head today. There would be no middle ground when the truth finally spoke. "It's time." Reverend Hayes walked to the pulpit. His steps were measured, deliberate. The congregation grew quiet, sensing something different in his bearing. "Friends, neighbors, we gather today in God's house to speak of truth." His voice carried to every corner of the church. Strong and clear, without the tremor that had marked his speech in recent years. For too long, we've closed our eyes to injustice. We've let fear silence our voices. We've forgotten that God calls us to stand for what is right. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. People shifted in their seats, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of the sermon. "Today we break that silence." Hayes stepped aside. Arthur rose from the front pew, Thomas's papers in his hands. The rustling of clothing filled the church as every head turned toward him. "My name is Arthur Callahan. I'm Thomas Williams's brother." The congregation stirred. Thomas's name still carried weight in Redemption Creek, even months after his death. Thomas died trying to expose the truth about Silas Crane. Today, we finish what he started. Arthur held up the first document. A forged land deed, the signature barely matching the original owner's hand. Mrs. Chun's property, stolen through fraud. Mrs. Chun stood slowly, her small frame trembling but her voice steady. "He forged my husband's signature, took our land for 1/10 of its value." The congregation turned to look at her. Some faces showed surprise, others recognition. The truth had a way of confirming suspicions people had carried for years. Arthur lifted another paper. Miguel Santos's cattle records, documenting systematic theft over 3 years. Miguel Santos, 200 head of cattle, stolen and rebranded. Miguel rose from his seat, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "I saw my own cattle in his herds. Couldn't prove it then. Can prove it now." More murmurs. The evidence was mounting, each document another nail in the coffin of Silas's carefully constructed lies. Pete Morrison, cheated in a rigged card game. His land taken as payment for debts that were never real. Pete stood, swaying slightly but upright. His voice cracked when he spoke. The cards were marked, the dice were loaded. But the judge was bought. The congregation was fully engaged now. Whispered conversations passed between families. Recognition dawned on faces as people realized the scope of Silas's crimes. Arthur spread more papers on the altar. The evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption, of a man who'd stolen from anyone too weak to fight back. Widow Patterson, the Johnson family, old Tom Webster, all of them cheated. All of them robbed. One by one, the victims stood. Their voices joined in a chorus of testimony. Years of silence finally broken. The church doors burst open. Silas Crane strode down the aisle, his face dark with rage. 3 of his men flanked him, their hands resting on their guns. The congregation shrank back, remembered fear reasserting itself. "That's enough." Silas's voice cut through the testimonies. Several people sat down quickly, their brief courage already fading. "You're disrupting a church service." "I'm stopping a pack of lies." Arthur stepped forward, placing himself between Silas and the altar. The papers lay scattered behind him, Thomas's careful documentation finally seeing daylight. "The only lies here are the ones you've been telling for years. You think these sheep will protect you? They're cowards, every one of them." The insult hung in the air. Silas's contempt for the townspeople was finally spoken aloud, his mask of respectability stripped away. Reverend Hayes found his voice. "Maybe we have been cowards, but that ends today." The old preacher's words carried weight in the sacred space. People looked at him, then at each other, reading courage in familiar faces. Mrs. Chun stood again, her small voice carrying clearly. "I'm not a coward, not anymore." Miguel Santos rose beside her. "Neither am one." Pete Morrison straightened his shoulders. "Me neither." One by one, the victims stood again. Their courage was contagious, spreading through the congregation like wildfire. "He stole my land. He rustled my cattle. He cheated my family. He threatened my children." The voices multiplied. People who'd been silent for years found their words. The church filled with testimony, years of suppressed truth finally breaking free. Sheriff Dutch Davidson stood slowly. His face was pale, his hands shaking. The moment of choice had arrived. "I need to speak." Silas turned toward him, his eyes blazing with warning and threat. "Careful, Dutch. I've been careful too long." Dutch walked to the front of the church. His star caught the light, but it looked tarnished now, weighted with compromise and corruption. "Silas Crane owns me, has for years. He's got my daughter working in his house. Said if I didn't do what he wanted, she'd disappear." The confession hit the congregation like a physical blow. Their sheriff, their protector, was just another victim. "He made me look the other way, made me file false reports, made me cover up his crimes." Dutch's voice broke. Years of forced complicity poured out in a flood of words. Thomas Williams didn't die in an accident, he was murdered. Silas had him killed because he was getting too close to the truth. The church erupted. Voices raised in anger, in shock, in recognition. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Silas's men moved toward their guns, but the congregation was on its feet now. Dozens of people, unified in their anger, no longer afraid. "You're finished, Silas." Arthur's voice cut through the chaos. He held up the last of Thomas's papers, the most damning evidence of all. Letters to territorial officials. Bribes documented. Threats recorded. Everything you've done, all written down in black and white. Silas's face was twisted with rage and desperation. His carefully built empire was crumbling around him. "You think this changes anything? You think these people matter?" "They matter to me. They matter to us all." The voices came from every corner of the church. People who'd been silent for years were speaking up. The tide had turned, and there was no stopping it now. Silas looked around the church, seeing enemies where once he'd seen victims. His power was broken, his influence shattered. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." Arthur stepped forward, Thomas's papers in his hands. The evidence that had cost his brother his life would finally see justice done. "It's over, Silas, and you know it." The church doors opened again. Territorial marshals entered, their badges gleaming in the morning light. Dutch had sent for them, his first act of redemption. "Silas Crane, you're under arrest." The marshals moved through the congregation, their presence bringing the weight of real law to a town that had forgotten what justice looked like. Silas's men surrendered their guns without a fight. Faced with the entire town and territorial authority, they had no choice. The congregation watched in silence as Silas was led away in chains. Years of fear and oppression walked out the door with him. The church emptied slowly after the marshals left with Silas. People lingered in the doorway, reluctant to break the spell of shared courage. Children who'd witnessed history tugged at their parents' sleeves, not understanding why the adults looked different now. Arthur stood at the altar, gathering Thomas's papers. The evidence had served its purpose, but the documents still carried weight. Stories of lives interrupted, now finally acknowledged. Ilara touched his shoulder. Her presence was warm, steady, real in a world that had shifted beneath their feet. What happens now? Now we rebuild. The congregation had dispersed, but the church still held echoes of their voices. Years of silence broken in a single morning. The sound would linger in the rafters, a reminder that truth could still find its way home. Sheriff Dutch Davidson approached them, his badge in his hand. The star looked smaller now, less significant. Just metal and tin, meaningless without the integrity to back it up. "I need to resign." Arthur studied the broken man. Dutch's confession had freed him, but freedom came with a price. The weight of his choices would follow him wherever he went. The territory needs someone to keep order until they send a replacement. "Can't be me. I lost that right years ago." "Maybe, but you found it again today." Dutch turned the badge over in his hands. The metal was tarnished, worn smooth by years of compromise. But underneath the corrosion, something still gleamed. "You think redemption's possible?" "I think it's the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile." Arthur took the badge from Dutch's hands. The metal was warm, weighted with possibility. A symbol that could mean something again if the right person wore it. "Stay on as interim. Sheriff, help this town remember what honest law looks like." "What about you?" "I'm thinking about staying too." The words surprised Arthur even as he spoke them. He'd been a drifter for years, moving from town to town, never putting down roots. But Redemption Creek felt different now. It felt like home. Ilara smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. The expression transformed her face, revealing the woman she'd been before grief and fear had marked her. Thomas would like that. Thomas would like a lot of things about. Today, they walked outside together. The town spread before them, ordinary buildings housing extraordinary people. The same structures that had sheltered corruption now stood ready to house justice. Mrs. Chen was sweeping her front porch, the motion vigorous and purposeful. She looked up as they passed, her nod carrying more respect than words could convey. Miguel Santos was loading supplies into his wagon, preparing for the long ride back to his ranch. His cattle would graze safely now, without fear of midnight rustlers. Pete Morrison sat on the barbershop steps, his hands steady for the first time in months. The shaking had stopped when his fear died. "Look at them." Arthur followed Ilara's gaze. The people of Redemption Creek were going about their Sunday routines, but everything was different. They walked taller, looked each other in the eye, spoke with voices that carried weight. They remember who they are. They remember who they can be. They walked to the edge of town where Thomas's workshop stood. The building looked different in the afternoon light, less like a monument to the dead and more like a foundation for the living. "What will you do with it?" "Fix it up. Get the forge running again. This town needs a blacksmith." "And Thomas's investigation?" "That's finished, but his real work is just beginning." Arthur understood. Thomas's true legacy wasn't the papers that had brought down Silas. It was the community he'd died trying to protect. The people who'd found their voices in a church on a Sunday morning. I've been thinking about that deputy marshal position. The territory could use someone who understands justice. Someone who won't walk away when things get complicated. They reached the workshop door. The boards Arthur had pulled away yesterday lay stacked beside the entrance. The building was open again, ready for new purposes. We could make this work. We, the town, the people, you and me. Ilara's hand found his. Her fingers were warm, calloused from work, but soft enough to offer comfort. They'd been through fire together, and neither had burned. Thomas would approve. Thomas would want us to be happy. They stood where the public beating had occurred just days before. The same street, the same buildings, the same sky overhead. But the fear was gone, replaced by something stronger. I love you. The words came without planning, honest and necessary. Arthur had lost too much to let this moment pass unmarked. I love you too. They kissed in the middle of Main Street. Two people who'd found each other in the worst of times and chosen to build something better. The sun caught Arthur's new deputy badge, making it gleam with promise. A year later, the workshop hummed with activity. Ilara's hammer rang against the anvil, shaping metal into tools the growing town needed. Her sign hung proudly over the door. Williams and Callahan, blacksmiths. Arthur wore his badge with dignity, enforcing laws that meant something again. Dutch had earned back the town's trust, serving as his deputy until the day he died, peaceful in his bed, forgiven. The church held capacity crowds every Sunday, but not from fear. People came to celebrate community, to remember what they'd accomplished. Together, Reverend Hayes preached about courage and redemption, lessons he'd learned from his congregation. Mrs. Chun's store prospered, her property restored through territorial courts that finally functioned honestly. Miguel Santos's cattle grazed safely, his ranch expanding as prosperity returned to the valley. Pete Morrison opened a new saloon, one where the cards were honest and the dice fell true. His hands never shook again. The people of Redemption Creek had learned something valuable that Sunday morning. They'd learned that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stood together. They'd learned that courage was contagious, that hope could spread, that justice delayed was not justice denied. And in the workshop where it all began, where Thomas Williams had died for truth, the forge burned bright with new purpose. The sound of hammer on anvil echoed through the streets, a rhythm of reconstruction, of lives rebuilt from the ashes of fear. The town had found its name again. Redemption Creek, where people went to start over, to make things right, to remember that some things were worth fighting for. Arthur stood in the doorway, watching Ilara work. The afternoon light caught her hair, painted her face in gold and shadow. She looked up and smiled, the expression that had become his anchor in a world made new. What are you thinking about? Justice, community, the future, good thoughts, the best. Outside, children played in streets made safe by their parents' courage. Business flourished in buildings no longer shadowed by corruption. The sun set over a town that had remembered its soul. Arthur's badge caught the last light, a symbol of law restored and honor reclaimed. Thomas's papers lay filed away, their truth finally told. The workshop rang with the sound of honest work. Redemption Creek had lived up to its name. And in the end, that was all any town could ask for. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.